The Locked On Podcast Network presents the NFL Big 3 in 30. The three biggest stories in the NFL from our local experts at the Locked On Podcast Network. Bringing you the real story, why it matters, what's next, who wins the big game, and more, all in 30 minutes. The NFL Big 3 in 30 starts now with the biggest story in the NFL.
Another home game, another blowout loss for the Dallas Cowboys.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast.
We are breaking down this Cowboys blowout loss, 34-10 to the Houston Texans. Weirdly enough, this game was a lot closer than what the final score indicates. We're going to break it all down, but there was a point in this game where it was 17-10. The Cowboys were lining up to kick. I'm looking at it now, a 40-yard field goal, which certainly seems like automatic for Brandon Aubrey, and he missed it. And you make that field goal, you go into halftime, and it's 17-13. You get the ball at halftime. This feels like a game that could easily go your way. Things got out of hand, and really more in the fourth quarter. I don't want to say the Cowboys should have won this game or even could have won this game, but man, they were in this thing.
I mean, there was a point, actually, there was a moment when Aubrey had made that 64-yard field goal before the Cowboys accepted the personal foul penalty, that the Cowboys were, I think, within 4 points, right, of them. So
I think it would have been 20-13 and
20 to 7 points. So yeah, there would have been a 7.
But I think it was that's like the 2-minute mark of the third quarter. So you had the points at the board. I agreed with the decision, obviously, to take the penalty.
Absolutely.
Because you had a chance to score a touchdown and
get the ball back, right? Yeah.
Right, yeah.
So,
and cut it to a 3-point game.
mm-hmm.
It shows you this was mostly a fourth quarter where just things got a little wild.
Yeah, well, ultimately, and this is the kind of, there's a lot to talk about here, but ultimately, I think, one of the things you and I were talking about before the show started was this is not an NFL team right now. It's not an NFL quality team. They're playing with so many backups at so many different key spots that they could pretend to be an NFL team. I think they spent, especially the offense, right? They spent the whole second quarter at least pretending that they were an NFL offense and doing some stuff, but they couldn't string together whole, halves even of quality NFL football. I thought that the defense played out of their mind, especially early, all things considered, considering who was out there playing for them. But I think, the offense, like I said, outside of almost kind of an anomaly in the second quarter, they couldn't string together any quality play to kind of sustain anything. And ultimately the best situation the Cowboys could produce was only being behind by a touchdown or only being behind by, 3 or 4 points.
There was a point early in the fourth quarter where the game wasn't decided. I mean, but you kind of knew where that was going, but I believe it was a 2-score game. Here are some of the players that were out on the field for the Cowboys offense. It was Awesome Richards at left tackle. You had Brock Hoffman at left guard, TJ Bass at right guard. Brevin Spann-Ford was your only tight end on the field because Jake Ferguson left with a concussion. And then you had Ryan Flournoy, Jonathan Mingo, and Kevontae Turpin as 3 receivers on the field with Deuce Vaughn in the backfield. I was joking before the game that this had preseason game number 3 vibes. That's kind of what this thing turned into by the time we get to the fourth quarter.
Brevin Spann-Ford was your third most targeted receiver in this game. And the guy that was the second most targeted receiver of the game was a guy that was getting snaps behind Brevin Spann-Ford for the last few weeks in Luke Schoonmaker, who I thought actually had a pretty decent game. We can talk about mild positives at some point, but even then, I think you're to the point is that, outside of CeeDee Lamb and one pretty incredible Kevontae Turpin snap at wide receiver, they just don't have a lot of talent out there. And I think some people are looking at the Rico Dowdle numbers and going like, why? Well, he had a pretty terrible game. But listen, you and I spent all week talking about how the Cowboys run game needed to get going. And outside of Rico Dowdle and CeeDee Lamb, what else was there for this Houston defense to focus on? So it didn't make their job very difficult.
Just to follow up on the Rico Dowdle thing, according to the NFL Next Gen stats, he was 5 yards in rushing yards over expectations in this game. Show you how bad the offensive line was. Yeah, he actually played well in this game. What a weird offensive game for the Cowboys. What was so striking about this one is that we thought that Dallas needed to run the ball to limit the number of dropbacks Cooper Rush had. The Cowboys won dropbacks in this game in 18 carries, 2 of which were kneel downs by Cooper Rush. Like,
55 attempts, that's just like, that's ridiculous. Like that can't be a way to try to win the game. And honestly, like, even though the running game was not successful, like, the fact that the Cowboys would potentially try to run at least gave the defense something else to think about. Once they turned the ball over, once the double strip sack play happened, we'll talk about that, I'm sure, at some point. And the game kind of got out of reach, and the Houston defense knew that the Cowboys could only pass from there on out. That's when the floodgates really opened up in the pass rush, and then especially after you started losing a key offensive lineman on your line.
What a weird game. We're going to talk about Cooper Rush's performance, but big picture, Landon, the Cowboys are now 3-7 on the year. We have 7 more of these games we have to suffer through.
We have 7 more we have to
I know. I started counting the quarters over 28 quarters that we still have to watch.
I did see your 31 quarters until we draft Travis Hunter tweet, and I'm like, man, if only.
Where are we as a team right now? I mean, obviously, playoffs are so far in the rear view. Exactly. Thanks to Jim Mora. Is this as bad as you remember the Cowboys being, not as a team, maybe as a team as well, but like as a franchise? Is this one of the lower moments we've seen from them?
This is as bad as I remember This is as bad as I remember being a Cowboys fan. At least in those terrible 2000 years, you knew that they were going to be terrible. Like, they're starting Clint Sterner at quarterback. You didn't have playoff hopes when you're starting Clint Sterner. It's like, this is a situation where this Cowboys team, I think we had dulled expectations for sure, like, especially considering after what had happened last year. But considering where we were at expectation wise before, let's say, week 1 or before training camp, and where we are now, like, we've fallen off a cliff and then found a cliff at the bottom of that cliff and fell off it. Like, it's the expectations, the vibes around this team are terrible. Like, the one thing that we talked about that we were looking forward to having this team kind of develop or at least get some positive vibes out of was the youth, and especially on the offensive line. The offensive line has got nothing but worse, it seems like, at points, and then on top of that, more injured, and you, like I said, we might I really hope not. We might have seen Zach Martin play his last snap with the Dallas Cowboy. That's the kind of terrible that we're talking about, is that Zach Martin has an ankle injury, possibly playing his last year as a Dallas Cowboy, and that wasn't the lead of all the terrible things that happened to the Cowboys tonight in this season. So it's awful. Like, we're all suffering through this together. Is there anything at the light of the end of this tunnel that can make this worth it? Who knows? But the truth of the matter is that it's like you prepare yourself for how brutal these games are going to be, and that there's a chance the Cowboys get blown out. And every single game, it seems like the Cowboys find a way to break your heart a new way to like draw you back in. Just enough to, like, kind of brutalize you by the end of the game. It's like having a $1 billion stadium that can't open its roof without strips of metal falling down and almost killing people.
Good comp. I felt pretty numb in this game, to be honest. Like, even there was one time the Cowboys had to take a timeout because they had 12 guys on the field on special teams.
That was so ridiculous.
And then they had another goal line situation where they did get called for 12 guys on the field. It's just those little things have just kind of happened all year, where it's, at this point, you almost have to laugh, even though there's nothing funny about it, right?
Yeah.
It's a bad spot to be in. And we talk about all the time what's best for the franchise, and like, hey, you're probably better off long-term trying to get a top 5 pick. And I joke about getting Travis Hunter, all the time on Twitter, but like, what you don't want to do is to establish a culture where losing is acceptable and common. And I don't want to say that we're there yet, but you see some of the effort and some of the faces on the sideline, and I do wonder, like, are we getting close?
There's too many times when I look at some laughably embarrassing, terrible thing that's happening, like with this team on the field or off the field, and I'm like, wow, what a microcosm for this whole season. And at a certain point, it stops being about the season, it starts being about the team,
Yeah.
right? And that's what you worry, right? Like, what's the long-term effect on this team outside of, like, does it get so bad that you can't just simply wipe away the 2024 season as you enter 2025 and try to restart? Like, it lingers with you, and that's a legitimate concern, that they're just so bad and they stop believing in themselves that you have to find a way to turn that back around in 2025 instead of just hitting the ground running on a new season.
Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets. $150 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins. You could bet on Monday Night Football. The Houston Texans travel across the state to face the beleaguered Dallas Cowboys. 7-point favorites at Jerry World. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL.
The Daniel Jones era is over.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast.
Ladies and gentlemen, it has happened. The Giants have decided to bench quarterback Daniel Jones after 10 games this season, just up and down all over the place. Not the ending that either side really wanted. So the Giants are going to roll with Tommy DeVito as their starting quarterback. Now, what I'm going to do on today's show, this kind of an emergency podcast, if you will, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the timing, what went into the decision, the ramifications, the cap, why they chose DeVito over Locke, and just some other general thoughts about the whole situation, which is just very unfortunate for all sides involved. So that's going to be our show today. And again, thank you for tuning in. And by the way, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right, let's start with the obvious. Now, for weeks, I know I've been saying that the Giants have got to move on. They have to bench Daniel Jones. You see the inconsistency in his play. You see the plays that are not being made. And look, you can sit there and you can say, well, Daniel Jones is the reason why the Giants are on a 5-game losing streak and why the season has gone down the toilet. It's not all on him. Let's be fair to the guy. It's not all on him. That being said, what you want in your franchise quarterback is you want the guy to ultimately rise above the X's and O's. You want him to be able to make the plays that are there to be made, to make the right decisions. You want him to be able to load the team up on his shoulders and carry them across the finish line. And folks, Daniel Jones did some of that in 2022 when he, really looked like he had turned the corner. But this season, he didn't. And going into this season, the plan all along was to see if Brian Dable, who is a quarterback whisperer, despite, what has happened here, to see if he couldn't get Daniel Jones back on track. Because look, the poor play by Daniel Jones actually started last year before he had the injuries piled up on the team as well as for Jones. And it continued. Just not enough consistency from Jones. And there was some talk. It's kind of interesting. There was some talk over the weekend, and I had actually heard this as well, that the Giants' decision to bench Jones wasn't necessarily going to be a done deal. That's amongst the things they were going to consider was which quarterback gave them the best chance to win. And it was felt that despite his struggles, that Jones potentially can give them the best chance to win, despite his struggles. Now, that being said, staring them in the face, obviously, the $23 million injury guarantee, which the Giants were just flirting with fire every time they put him out there, especially given how he runs, how he doesn't slide, how he leads with his head and his shoulder. That was definitely staring them in the face. Although they'll say it was a football decision, that's part of the football decision, folks. So you had that staring them in the face. The other thing, there was a sentiment that they may stick with him, that they might stick with him this week against Tampa. But the feeling was, well, if we stick with him and he doesn't do well again or something happens, now we have a short work week because we've got Dallas coming up in 4 days after we play the Bucks. And do we really want to, have to worry about a quarterback change then? So the timing of it factored in, because I think had the Giants maybe had an extra, had a full week in between the Tampa game and the Dallas game, would they have maybe gone in a different direction? It's possible. I don't think they would have personally, because I think, it should have ended, when it did. But there was some talk that there might be that they might give him, another week to try. I didn't think it was going to happen personally. The reports that I read, the reports that I heard, I didn't think it was going to happen because it didn't make sense. You spend the bye week, you start getting ready for whoever your next quarterback's going to be. And that next quarterback, believe it or not, is going to be Tommy DeVito. It's not going to be Drew Lock. So before I get to, why they went with Tommy Cutlets over Drew Lock, let's just talk about the ramifications of benching Daniel Jones. I mentioned the injury guarantee. The Giants and Jones, who are all but certain now to divorce in the upcoming offseason, the Giants will save $19.395 million on Jones's salary. Okay, so that injury guarantee will not kick in. And if the Giants cut him before the start of the league year, they will also not be on the hook for $12 million guaranteed money. So I fully expect Jones will be released before the start of the 2025 league year. Now the dead money is going to be $22.210 million in against the cap. Jones is not going to be, I don't think at any rate, he is not going to be a post June 1st transaction. I think the Giants are going to want that $19.395 million to spend in free agency next year. Really, folks, if you think about it, it's really an extra $11.105 million. Not really a bad, a deal breaker. It's a nice chunk of change, but the cap's going to go up. So I think, and this is why I think he's going to be a pre-June or a standard cut. The cap's going to go up. They're going to be able to absorb that. Hopefully they won't have to make any other, big cuts that necessitate more dead money being dumped into the cap. But, this is just how it was trending. It was unfortunate. They tried to get the most out of him. And again, the plan all along at the start of the season was to give him another opportunity. They figured with the better offensive line, they figured with Malik Neighbors, a number one receiver, with Dable calling the plays, everything was in place for Daniel Jones to do well. There were no more excuses. Some of you might say, well, what about the running game? Saquon Barkley, he wasn't there. Well, no, Saquon's not there, but Tyrone Tracy's doing pretty well. So you can't really even blame the running game. Unfortunately, Daniel just sees ghosts. He makes questionable decisions. He doesn't see plays that are there to be made. And decision has been made that he no longer is the guy to lead this offense. He is no longer the guy to lead this team. And look, I'll just close out this segment by saying it's unfortunate. I know I've spoken out about Daniel Jones. I know a lot of you have as well. I wanted him to do well because if he does well, the team does well. All right. So I did not want him to fail. I really wanted him to do well. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. I tried believing in him, but week after week, the evidence just kept stacking up to where I just couldn't do it anymore, as I'm sure is the case with a lot of you. So I don't wish Daniel Jones any ill will. I think a fresh start is going to benefit him, and he will get that fresh start next spring. And the Giants, they're just going to have to move on and find their next franchise quarterback because, they had hope that Jones was going to be the guy, and he's not. And here's a little piece of trivia for you, by the way. When Jones started his career back in 2019, his first game was against the Tampa Bay Bucks. His last game just fell short of a game against the Tampa Bay Bucks. So a little bit of trivia there. I know I'm stretching it a little bit, but just a little bit of trivia because the Bucks factor into, this whole. They're a little like side note, if you will.
Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Curation makes it easier to save on sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more near you. You can take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first ticket purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time.
Vikings are on a 3-game win streak in great.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast.
First question I am going to answer comes from Adam Kleinsasser, who asks, is the freak out for the Titans game really necessary? I feel like I'm the only one that is happy with the win and not mad for a bad game. I'm so glad that people are asking about this. So, yeah, what? What are we doing? So, I don't know. Maybe my perception is warped because of the football party. And if you listen to Locked On Vikings, you get the Minnesota football party in that same audio feed Mondays and Thursdays. And the title that Sam used for that was like Vikings learning how to win ugly, or like mastering the ugly win, as if that were an ugly win. And I just don't think it was an ugly win. This was an absolute drumming. It's a drumming. Arif had a whole bunch of stats on the football party about it. You can go listen to those. But it was a 2-score win. The Vikings covered the spread. Yeah, there were they benefited from a couple ref calls. I went over it in a lot of detail yesterday. They benefited from mistakes as much as it was, ref luck. It was also, the other team screwed up and lined up offsides. That's on them. And the Vikings didn't make those mistakes. The team that made more mistakes lost and less mistakes won. By golly. What a shocker. And the Vikings winning a game by not making a lot of mistakes is something that we've been like begging for. So why does it feel so weird? And I think part of it is just because that game was sleepy. The Titans are not a good team, right? And I guess my question becomes, what do you expect to happen next time the Vikings play a bad team? I don't know. The rest of the teams on their schedule are at least okay. But, let's just say, sake of argument, the Vikings have a bad team coming up on the schedule. Like, going into that game, what needs to happen for you to be satisfied? Do they need to win 52-6? Like, is that what needs to happen? Because that happens like once every 2 years when a team just hangs 50 on someone. Like, that never happens in the NFL. I think some of this is like, especially if you watch a lot of college and you watch a lot of NFL. I don't watch a lot of college football, so I don't get this. But when people who watch a lot of college football then watch NFL football too, I feel like they apply those same expectations where you feel like, Auburn has to play against like Georgia Southern, and that is a spread of 45.5 points. And, you're going to kill them. And if you only win by 20, it's like a disappointment. And I feel like we're applying that same logic. But in the NFL, there are no cupcakes. Okay? There are no cupcakes. There's no such thing as a cupcake in the NFL. The first best team can play the 32nd best team, and that 32nd best team still has every chance in the world to win. It does not always go like the Lions-Jaguars game, where you could argue that is exactly what happened, and it was this huge blowout. Because everybody in the NFL was all conference, even on the worst teams. Everybody wants it really bad. Everybody's coaching for their job. Everybody's doing this at the highest level. So winning, basically no drama at the end. There really wasn't. I mean, it was a 2-score game. They were like maybe driving down, looking for an onside kick, and they got picked off on like the first play. Like, that was as no drama of a win as you'll ever get. So why are people freaking out? I think, honestly, your expectations for an NFL game are too high. A good team took it to a bad team and won 23-13. Absolutely no drama, breezy win. That brings me to the next question, which comes from Jay Love, who asks, could you tell us what's wrong with us Vikings fans? Defense is dominating, offense is owning time of possession and putting up first downs like crazy. Why are we so doom and gloom with so much upside? This is a great one. I'm actually going to steal one from Matt Fry's. Over this 3-game win streak, they have gained 81 first downs on offense, and their opponents have gained 34 first downs. That is, I think, a great way to illustrate how these games have gone. The Vikings are putting together 10, 11, 12 play touchdown or field goal drives and then getting 3 and outs on the other way or turnovers or whatever. And then, a couple of turnovers the other way, a couple of stupid mistakes, or maybe, keeping these games not quite looking like the blowouts that they are. But the Vikings are strongly outplaying the teams that they're supposed to outplay, right? So what's wrong with this? Why are we so doom and gloom with so much upside? And again, I think because we have set an impossible expectation, I think it is a very good thing to look in the mirror. I'm not accusing you or anybody specifically of doing this, okay? But I do think we should all check on ourselves. Look in the mirror and ask, what needs to happen for me to be happy with the Vikings, right? I made a point to do this when I went into this, because I went into the season really negative. Y'all remember. And I made a point to say, okay, what needs to happen for me to not be negative? Well, they need to go beat the 49ers week 2. Guess what? They did, and I did. And I followed through. I think you all have to have that. And I don't know if enough people have thought of the answer to that question. What do they need to do? Well, do they need to just rip through these next 3 games? Colts, Jaguars, Titans, we have to rip through, win all 3 of these, and then I'll be happy. Okay, well, they did. What do they have to do next? Beat the Bears? Do they have to beat them by 40? That might not be a realistic thing to ask, right? They're favored right now by 3.5 on FanDuel. Cover that spread? Okay, that's maybe a more reasonable. Cover that spread. Great. Well, they've covered in 2 of the last 3, maybe 3 of the last 3, depending on when you got the Jags. I think there were times where you could have gotten them before it was clear that Trevor Lawrence was starting. You could have gotten the Vikings minus 4.5 and then covered that, but. Maybe that's it, but I think you got to establish what a reasonable expectation is for this next game for your own self. What will make you happy? And for me, divisional game on the road, any dub I'm happy with. Okay, these sloppy Soldier Field wins, I take them all the time, and they've actually racked a couple of those up in a row. So if they get another one and they win 19-13 and it's sloppy and it's filled with penalties and it's awful because that's how Soldier Field Bears games go, okay, I'm taking it. I'm going to be perfectly happy with it. Nick D asks, Dalton Reisner gave up 2 pressures. Not great, not horrendous. Why was his PFF grade 50? Is he really that bad? So this is from somebody who is, I think this one was from Blue Sky, and Blue Sky people might not know my PFF thing yet. So I'll give you that. The grade, single game grades, most people at PFF will not stand by the math of a single game grade. They see grades more as an aggregate thing over whole seasons, over multiple seasons. You can do math with them. They get more stable and all that. I still have my issues there. But single game grades are completely useless to me. It's not that I necessarily disagree with them. I actually do agree with this one. But I also know that it's not opponent adjusted. That's a big thing. So the fact that Dalton Reisner drew Jeffrey Simmons for most of the game, it doesn't factor into that number. So you have to factor that in yourself. You have to say, yeah, I got a 50, but it was against Jeffrey Simmons. You have to decide how much that means to you. And maybe that's the answer. He got a lot of Jeffrey Simmons. But there are plenty of L's on that tape. And I'll table the rest of that conversation. I have a Patreon post up at patreon.com/LukeBraunNFL where I actually did an entire film breakdown of Ed Ingram and Dalton Reisner. And I'm going to write an article at Wide Left as well. That should be up by Wednesday. So you should be able to see that soon as well. Lego Cam asks, everybody's been calling for Naylor to be nixed after that game. Has he been poor enough to drop from 3rd to 4th wide receiver in exchange for Powell? Yeah, I think people are probably overreacting to a couple of drops. It was really that one sequence. That was the only really time. Otherwise, that he was fine, right? And sometimes he's in clear out jail because, Jefferson, Addison, Hawkinson are more important and are going to be earlier in the progression. And Jalen Naylor just needs to be fast and run cardio. Sometimes that's your job. It sucks, but that's your job sometimes. Be fast. But of course you had that deep post where it wasn't a perfect throw. People call that a perfect dot and dime. No, he had to come back for that. He had to slow up for that ball. So it wasn't perfect, but it was very good. And it did hit him right in the chest. He kind of body catches it. It clatters off the pads. Pretty classic mistake. And then the very next play, they throw an out to him that he needed to carve back down for. So I wouldn't call it a drop, but it's a bad rep because, I mean, it was like way outside his frame. So I don't know. I wouldn't chart that as a drop. Apparently it was charted as a drop sometimes by some people, but I don't think that that's necessarily as fair, but I do think it's a bad play because when you run that out, you want to carve it back down to the quarterback so that you prevent interceptions, right? Way harder for a corner to jump that. It's safer, and Darnold was, I think, expecting that, so he threw it a little bit shorter, and Naylor wasn't in the right spot. So that's a couple of bad reps. 2 bad reps doesn't get you benched. Sometimes people want to bench you after 2 bad reps. I think you all would make very bad coaches. Cause just chill. Hey, you got to do better than that on the 2 reps, right? Coach it up. Tell him, hey, you got to carve that thing out. Hey, don't body catch, right? Talk to him, and fix that issue. People get benched when they go game after game after game after game after game after game having the same issue, right? That's going to be the subject of all the Ed Ingram stuff. But you start benching people after singular sequences, little clusters of bad plays. You're going to bench and unbench everybody so much, you're going to look super indecisive. So yeah, your standard for benching has to be way different than that.